As we take a look at the social welfare programming during the George W. Bush administration, that is the first 8 years or so of the new century, you probably have noticed that Phyllis Day is not a very big fan of Bush or the Bush-Cheney policies during the 8 years. And it's interesting that she really talks about Bush and Cheney because in most of the other chapters, she really doesn't make much mention of the vice president. But clearly she, and I would say other individuals who are sensitive to the goings on in Washington would agree that Dick Cheney had an oversized voice for a vice president in this particular administration. One of the hallmarks of the Bush administration has been tax cuts for the wealthy. And while there has been quite a bit of attention placed on that in the years since the Bush administration came to an end, if you're paying attention to the news, at least, it's been obvious that those tax cuts have been very, very difficult to roll back, even though the economy has encountered some very difficult times. These tax cuts were based upon the old trickle-down theory implemented during the Hoover administration and during the Reagan years, which basically says that if you put money in the hands of the wealthy, that those are the individuals who invest in the economy and that they'll invest in new industry and new jobs such that the economy will do well and the workers will benefit because the economy will be working at full employment. As most people have noticed, this doesn't seem to work the way the theory says it should, and this cartoon is a very good illustration of how many people think trickle-down economics actually works. And you see the corporate fat cat protected by the bags of corporate cash, whereas the average citizen there stands in the rain, and that's the average citizen's portion of benefits of the trickle-down theory, at least according to what many people believe. At the end of the Clinton administration, we actually had a national surplus in our national budget, and that's something that we hadn't seen for quite a long time. There was very prosperous economic times during this era that was sort of that tech bubble that you might have heard talked about in the 90s, where all the dot-com industries became fabulously wealthy for the first time, and perhaps it was a bubble that was bound to burst, but in any event, during the Clinton years, we wound up with a national budget surplus of some $230 billion. By the time, and this is when George Bush came into office, but by the time that he left office 8 years later, the national budget had a deficit of around $9 trillion. And there were a few things that contributed to that, one of which being the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and United Flight, I believe it was 93, those things all happened on September 11th of 2001, partway into George Bush's first year as president. He led us into war in Afghanistan and shortly thereafter into Iraq. And you can see here the costs of the wars being estimated around $400 billion. In 2008, $195 billion. The Iraqi war itself was costing about $1 million a day to run. And so this certainly was one of the things that ate up much of the national budget during these years and continues to do so to this day, in fact. And as Phyllis Day points out, the focus on foreign wars, as it did during World War II, really distracted attention from a number of the domestic social welfare issues that in particular needed attention. At the same time, as I believe Phyllis Day was the author that put this, that while we were kind of watching the war and not paying much attention, the religious right sort of crept back into influence around the presidency, and she refers to George Bush's presidency as being God-directed. He really talked about Christ being his personal savior as the person that helped him to stop, or the individual or whatever that helped him to stop drinking and doing cocaine, I guess, and those kinds of things that he had done as a young man. And so there was a real moralistic tone to the Bush administration, despite the many scandals that came to the surface during the years in his years in the White House. The Supreme Court, not surprisingly, moved towards a conservative right. Ronald Reagan's appointee, Sandra Day O'Connor, the first female Supreme Court justice, retired, I should say, during the Bush administration. O'Connor, at the time that Reagan appointed her, it was considered to be kind of a sure bet to be a conservative justice. But as will happen sometimes when justices get on the court, they they tend to move in another direction. And usually, I think the experience tells us that Supreme Court justices move to the left politically when they're on the Supreme Court. And in any event, Sandra Day O'Connor became the swing vote in what was otherwise a sharply divided court of 4 conservatives and 4 liberals. And she was the person that oftentimes made the deciding vote either for or against a certain conservative or liberal cause. And she wasn't particularly predictable. But she could lean towards the left at different times, and so I think many of the liberals in our nation felt that we lost something when she retired from the court. Certainly, and you say I said we. That tells you a little bit about my own political preferences, if you haven't guessed that by now. Samuel Alito was appointed to replace her. Alito is one of the most conservative justices on the bench at the present time. And when our conservative Chief Justice William Rehnquist died, John Roberts was appointed to replace him quite quickly, in fact. And I think the youngest Supreme Court justice perhaps ever. I mean, the Chief Justice, the youngest Supreme Court Chief Justice, I believe, ever. And he also is pretty sharply conservative. And so the court certainly has a conservative group of justices at the present time, even with President Obama's 2 female appointees in the last few years. Faith-based initiatives also were pushed to the foreground and funded during the Bush years. There is a fund called the Compassion Capital Fund that was started up with $141 million, and its intent was to support grassroots organizations, including many religious organizations, to expand their own social service programs. Another thing that contributed to the deficit, the national deficit, was what a lot of people refer to as welfare for the rich, or a corporate welfare. There were, during the Bush administration, large tax cuts for corporations and for the wealthy that were implemented. And we have heard over the last several years about the Bush tax cuts and whether or not they're being extended by Congress. This is what they're talking about. The capital gains taxes were reduced, and the capital gains is, when a capital gain, for instance, would be, if you buy a house and you make a lot of money on it, when you sell it, that's a capital gain. And so these are things, again, that if you don't know what capital gains is all about, it's because you really don't have the money that you need to know about it. And so that tells you this is something that also supports the wealthy. Corporate interest rates were lowered. The federal budget deficit returns not too far into the Bush years and begins to grow. Estate taxes were also phased out. These are taxes, inheritance taxes, basically, when an individual dies and leaves estate behind. Again, more of a matter for the wealthy than for the rest of us. So by 2004, which was the end of his first administration, there was more than $2 trillion in tax cuts that have been aimed at the top 2% of the income strata in the United States. And we had budget deficits at near a little over $9 trillion by 2006. And the interest on that debt alone was nearly $430 billion a year. Might have been welfare for the rich, but it was tough times for the poor. More than 37 million Americans lived at or below the poverty level in 2003, even though more than half had had at least one family member who had worked in the year before, and 20% of those had worked full time. And so this is what the working poor was experiencing, even going deeper into poverty itself. Not welfare recipients, we're talking about working poor here. At the same time, when you look at the business world, the average income for chief executive officers of corporations was $10.8 million per year. The average income, $10.8 million a year. The median income for the United States households in around the same time period, a little over $48,000. When we say median income, we mean that's the midpoint, so that half of the incomes in the United States are above that, half are below. So the middle income worker there, $48,000 a year, compared to $10.8 million for the CEOs on average. Day looks at and kind of assesses where we're at in the present day, or at least at the end of the Bush administration, in terms of what she calls 4 levels of income security. And the levels of income security, the line represent the line from basic well-being to abject poverty. And you see the 4 levels that she identifies here, and we'll look at each of these levels now. First, for employment. In other words, if you have a job, you're taking care of yourself, and that's certainly income security. And 8 million workers were available for work in 2005 at the start of Bush's second administration, but were unemployed, including the underemployed, and these are people who have some work but not as much as they should have, or they're working below their skill level. If you include the underemployed, the rate of unemployment at that time would have been about 8.4%. Union membership fell during this time, and part of the reason for this, she suggests, is because many of the corporations went transnational. They found it was much cheaper to move their manufacturing industry, and also much more lucrative to move their manufacturing industries out of the nation. I think we had talked about that in the last chapter, because of the fact that they don't have the regulations on their industry and pollution standards and things like that to worry about, nor do they have the minimum wage to worry about. And so it's cheaper. They make bigger profits if they move out of country. And with that, our union membership fell because there were less union jobs available. Nearly half of the workers in the job market were women, yet minorities were more likely to be let go as companies downsized during this era. The Earned Income Tax Credit, the EITC, is what Phyllis Day refers to as probably America's best program for reducing poverty. And this again is a credit, and I think we talked about this in the last chapter as well. It's a credit that directly reduces tax liability for low-income families based on the income. So this basically returns some money from taxes to poor families, and this is one of the things that not only reduces poverty because it puts some money back in the pockets of the needy, but it also, some folks have called this one of those steps towards a guaranteed minimum national income. Veterans benefits were available, but were linked to family income as well, and so what veterans did receive depended in large part upon how much the family had coming into the home, but did have cost of living allowances included in their benefits. And during this era, with the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, monies were added to the funds that support that act for transportation to increase access to employment for those covered by ADA, and for funding to train individuals in new technology. The second level of income security, social insurance, includes the government retirement and unemployment insurances. So first, for Social Security, 48.5 million people received Social Security in 2005. You can see how utterly important this program is to the economy of our nation and to the well-being of its citizens. And yet, the Bush administration worked very vigorously at different times during this administration to cut back or to privatize Social Security pensions. There was a real push to change part of the pensions, for at least for younger workers, to a 401k kind of a fund where they could take that money and invest it. Now, there is a lot of concern about the stability of Social Security in the long run, and I'm not going to go into that here at length. There is a lot of disagreement about whether or not, in fact, the Social Security fund is as threatened as the government sometimes puts forward. And as we covered in last week's lecture, frankly, if the federal government would leave the Social Security fund alone and had done that, the Social Security fund would be quite all right, but it borrows from the Social Security fund for other things. But setting that aside, what Bush wanted to do, because of the supposed instability of the Social Security fund, was to have a portion of the Social Security deductions handed over to workers to invest as they would invest wherever they want to in the market, more or less, in a 401k kind of thing. And of course, if you're good at investment and you're active manager of those funds, that's fine. But for those of us that might not be so good, financially speaking, it really kind of dooms individuals perhaps to a much more sparse income at the time of retirement. never got passed. American Association of Retired Persons, along with other organizations, really lobbied hard against any changes to Social Security. And well, who knows what's ahead in the next 4 years, depending, as things look, how it looks. Whether other changes will be proposed to this in the future, I would keep my eye on this, and it's going to affect all of us as we retire. Social Security disability applications were backlogged terribly in 2007, and the average waiting period for applicants to get hearings was 520 days. That's something less than 2 years. Unemployment insurance and workers' compensation. Unemployment compensation provides, around 60% of one's earnings for up to 26 weeks. And it depends on what your earnings are, of course, but around 60% of that. And the idea is that you're out looking for work during that period of time. But at the end of 26 weeks, those benefits run out. And if you don't have work by then, you just don't have income. And so the federal governments have at different times extended unemployment compensation, and at the present time the current administration has unemployment compensations limits extended with Congress's help, and because of the high unemployment rate at the present time. In 2004, 3.6 million individuals used up all of the unemployment insurance funds before getting all of their unemployment insurance funds before getting work. In other words, they took them more than 26 weeks before they could find a job. Workers' compensation, which covers us when we are injured on the job, was affected by a Bush decision to cut back on the OSHA funding. OSHA is the Office of Occupational Safety and Health Administration. I knew that. And this is the organization that oversees work sites and makes sure that work sites are safe for individuals that work there. And so Bush really kind of cut back on some of the federal requirements for OSHA and allowed companies in many respects to move towards a voluntary compliance with safety standards, which really puts workers at risk. The third level of income security would include public assistance, and these mostly are the means-tested kinds of programs that are out there to assist people who don't have Social Security or unemployment or workers' comp. And one type of public assistance program that they talk about that we don't have in our area here in Alaska is what's called general assistance or temporary assistance. Some states refer to it as poor relief. But it's offered by 40 of the 50 states to clients who are ineligible for any other kind of cash assistance. And so for people who are really destitute, there is this general assistance fund, sometimes administered by local governments, such as the county where I came from in Central Florida before I moved to Alaska. Orange County Social Services administered the general assistance funds there. And some of the areas, some of the states have residency requirements before you can draw general assistance funds. But in the event, they're more widely accessible than we might think for those of us that are living in Alaska. And in some states also require drug alcohol testing before anyone could qualify for these funds. The SSI program roles increased during the Bush years, suggesting that there was an increase in poverty and a failure of the welfare to work programs. The TANF program, which is of course a major program in the public assistance arena, this is so much of what she's been writing about in the last few chapters. The caseloads declined by 60% since the time the program was implemented in 1994, so that there were fewer than 2 million recipients by I think 2009 in the TANF program. Improvements in the economy during the 1990s that I had referenced earlier probably had a lot to do with the reduction of individuals on TANF, as much as and perhaps the greater use of the Earned Income Tax Credit may have had some impact on the reduction in program rules, and not necessarily the changes in rules that they claim caused it. Few individuals were able to hold jobs for a full year once coming off of TANF, and the child care promises with the TANF program for child care coverage really fell short in terms of the numbers of providers. There were not enough child care agencies and child care providers available to assist families who were coming off of TANF. The federal government also allowed private companies such as Lockheed and IBM to take over contracts to administer TANF in different states. So here you have profit-making organizations running the welfare programs in states. And mind you, Lockheed is an engineering program, a space engineering program, airplanes and rockets and things like that. IBM, of course, you know what IBM is, and nothing much to do with social welfare, but nonetheless, these organizations took over administration of these programs in some states. Also, another interesting thing, I believe it was the California social workers sued the state of California so that they could stop doing midnight raids. They felt that it was demeaning to clients and a violation of privacy, and California insisted upon those workers continuing to do this to carry out, to reduce welfare fraud and those kinds of things. And I think this did go to the Supreme Court. And in 2007, the Supreme Court upheld the California rules requiring these home searches, saying that this was really all about trying to determine eligibility, that it was necessary for that. And so it wasn't for any criminal purposes, they thought. So basically, the Supreme Court felt that the TANF recipients really didn't need a warrant to have their home searches. If a social worker felt the home needed to be searched, that's all that was necessary. And the food and nutrition actually could almost go under the last category, which is survival by any means, rather than being a part of a level 3 income security. But as I read the day text, at least she includes this in the level 3. And it's kind of interesting because there is some subtle changes in terms of how we describe poverty and hunger that is pointed out here by the federal administration. Where poverty now becomes what's called income insecurity, and hunger becomes food insecurity. It's sort of a softer way of describing very, very harsh realities. Reminds me of when I started teaching a class at the college here on child abuse and neglect. One of the books that I made use of in the first few offerings of the class talked about how we talk about domestic violence being family violence, and as though the violence was equally spread. The perpetrators, were just as much the children as the parents, and just as much the women as the men, and those kinds of things. Whereas really what we should call it is wife battering, which is what it really is. And just to show you again the way things go, I'm putting together a class for the fall, by the way, of 2012 for the UAA School of Social Work, and also I think KPC will have it on there. In their catalog as well, and it's Social Work SWK 290, and it will be called Understanding Family Violence. So we're going to use the softer term, but we'll be talking about wife beating and child abuse and things like that during the semester in that class. But in any event, words sometimes are used to kind of soften the impact of what it is that we're really talking about here. And you can see that in the food stamp program, and this program kind of evolved during the Bush administration into what it is today. It was, I think, essentially turned over to the states for administration. Most of the 28% of the recipients were working age women, and almost 50% of the recipients in the food stamp program were children. That's about 13 million children were benefiting from the food stamp program. Understand, when Congress talks about cutting back these kind of benefits, children are the ones who are the primary ones that are hurt the most by those cutbacks. Likewise, school lunch, school breakfast programs, they were put in place. They were funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. There were child and adult care food programs that she talks about as well. These programs that are available for kids in institutions, for instance, where institutions children's homes and treatment programs and those kinds of things can apply for federal funding to assist in providing an adequate diet for children in those facilities. There's a commodities food program available that was proposed by, actually it was George Bush proposed that that program be eliminated because so many of the recipients getting commodities receive food stamps. totally missing the point, of course, that the commodities program supplemented the food for these needy families and that they really needed it. And I believe the program continued to exist. The Women's Infant and Children Nutrition Program, or WIC. This is a program that, again, that provides, you know, milk and dairy products and those kinds of things, very important nutritional items to pregnant women and to mothers with young children, or to young children, I should say. This program was reauthorized in 2004, although sometimes the WIC program is also threatened by for funding cutbacks by individuals and the more conservative persons in Congress. And of course, local food banks, soup kitchens, emergency shelters also existed. And again, I would put them more in the category of the level 4, which is the survival level. And we're really talking about homeless persons here. And just some statistics. There are about 8.5 million people that need housing, and only about 6.7 million affordable rentals available. So you can see, structurally speaking, almost 2 million individuals would wind up being homeless, you know, under these statistics. I think that means that there are rentals available for 6.7 million people, not, you know, because obviously not everybody would live in their own rental. But the number of homeless veterans increased during the Bush administration to where they were representing about 25% of the homeless population. And we will talk a little bit later about how veterans have been were treated during the Bush administration as they were returning from the Iraq and Afghani wars. Homeless public school students were up by 50% during this administration as well. And you can see the breakdown there, ethnically speaking, for who make up the homeless. And for instance, you know, African Americans are almost half of the homeless, and yet, remember again, I think it's about 12% of the national population are African American, and yet among the homeless, they represent 49% of the population, and that certainly suggests the existence of some racial oppression and inequalities there. When you look at healthcare under the Bush, and Phyllis Day refers to it as the Bush-Cheney presidency, and I think she does that on purpose because there were an awful lot of people that felt that Dick Cheney really was running the White House, and that's not the case, of course, but he had a lot of influence during the first 4 years, at least, is what everybody seems to think. But anyway, during the Bush-Cheney administration, Medicare, there were some changes implemented for Medicare. One, Medicare C, which is, I think, referred to as Medicare Advantage. And again, this is one of those little plays with words that our leaders will sometimes use to tell us it's better to use Medicare Advantage than the regular Medicare. And what this did is that it offered privatized fee-for-service plans as an alternative to the traditional Medicare, where, you know, some certain doctors will accept Medicare and they bill the federal government. The federal government pays them a paltry amount back, and that's why so many doctors don't want to take Medicare. And aside from the bureaucracy that goes with getting payment, I suppose. So Medicare Advantage, once again, kind of suggested to persons that they could shop around for providers, and but it turns out that there's an awful lot of things that aren't covered under Medicare Advantage, and when you kind of step back from it and look at things, the statistics at least indicated that the cost for the consumers under this plan was still about 19% more than it would have been under the traditional plan. So it seems that it was a way of shifting some of the burden of this program off to the consumer while telling them it was an advantage for them to do this. Medicare is another area that is going to continue to get attention in the years ahead, because it is a very large expense. You know, we have the baby boomers going into retirement now, and it will be drawing on Medicare, and this is a pretty big concern. And so the government's looking for some ways to reduce costs, and I think the interesting thing about Medicare Advantage is that it almost seems as though it was marketed as a way that it was better for the consumer, when really it was seems to have been a cost-shifting program, at least. Medicare D is the prescription drug plan that was signed into law during the Bush administration, and it offers choice of insurance companies for an individual to buy prescriptions. And Phyllis Day says that what was offered was just so confusing and so complex that it was very difficult to determine what was the best plan to take. Um, and so there's been an awful lot of criticisms. And again, the sense that a lot of people who study these things have is that really this was all about getting more profits to the pharmaceutical industry. Individuals, for instance, were finding that you can get prescriptions cheaper in Canada if you order drugs from Canada, and so there have been attempts to kind of close that and to keep Americans to prevent Americans from purchasing their medications in Canada through the mail. And so anyway, this Medicare D drug plan is set up that's supposedly supposed to make it easy for individuals to purchase prescriptions, but there is this thing called the donut hole that was developed, in which there's a limit to how much Medicare will pay for prescriptions, and that's and in what was it? I don't know what year this was, but the it's maybe let's say $2,400, I think, or something like that was the limit that Medicare D would pay for prescriptions, and that until you reached what was called catastrophic levels, which was like $3,800, you had no coverage. So when you hit catastrophic levels, the Medicare would kick back in. So you have this hole, this gap between, the limits of normal prescription coverage and where catastrophic coverage kicks in. And so the elderly then were responsible for those that had a number of prescriptions. And as you get older, you have a lot of prescriptions, and they are expensive. So there's about a $1,400 gap there in the middle that's called a donut hole that the elderly have been responsible for paying for out of their pockets if they wanted to keep taking their medication. And, of course, a lot of that meant a lot of the elderly stopped taking medications at that stage. So that is one of the things that the Obama healthcare plan intends to eliminate, and I believe they've actually started working at reducing that donut hole gradually. But again, that increases the cost of Medicare, and that's a big concern in our current environment. Medicaid under the Bush-Cheney years, there weren't a lot of changes made during the administration of George W. Bush. There was a cost hike in 2007 of about 10%. Phyllis Day talks about individuals in nursing homes, and this is where probably some of Medicaid's largest expenses are, is paying for nursing homes, and you can see that the percentages of individuals in nursing homes have decreased from 1990 to the more recent years, perhaps in part because of the Older Americans Act, which provides assistance to the elderly individuals in nutrition and health services, and helping to avoid nursing home care. Trying to enable elderly to stay in the home and to get services to them in the home themselves. Earlier we had spoken about the children's health insurance programs. It's actually the S-CHIP. I think I might have referred to them as the CHIP program. Denali Kid Care is Alaska's version of this program, and since 1997 the S-CHIP program has offered health insurance to children and families who have income too high to qualify for Medicaid. And I believe the standard remains at 200% of the federal poverty level, that families can qualify for health insurance for their children up to 200% of the federal poverty level. I believe above a certain level there's a sort of a sliding fee that individuals do pay, so that the more income they have on towards the higher end, the less coverage that the S-CHIP programs offer. The Congress proposed an increase in funding twice during the Bush years, and George Bush vetoed them both. And although he provided other reasons for this, one of the reasons he stated was that private health insurance firms would be harmed because families would drop the coverage with them in favor of the S-CHIP program if we continue to bring more and more people into that program. It's interesting that he's concerned about the health insurance firms, and it just gives you an idea of how powerful those lobbies are with Congress and with the White House. And Michael Moore certainly suggested that in his movie Sicko that I hope that you watched a few weeks ago. So in any event, by the end of the Bush administration, Congress gave George Bush what he wanted and just continued to fund the program at current levels and let the next administration deal with it. Despite the influx of war veterans after the Iraq War in particular that had extensive healthcare needs, the Veterans Administration was given no increases in staffing, administratively or otherwise. And so we had a lot of soldiers coming back from the war and getting inadequate services from the Veterans Administration. And Phyllis Day points in particular to veterans returning with post-traumatic stress disorder who were being discharged for bad behavior. There wasn't a recognition of the psychiatric nature of the disorder that was brought about by the trauma that these young men were having and young women were having to deal with in combat zones. And so the end result of that is because they were discharged for bad behavior, they were denied health care benefits because they were given dishonorable discharges. And veterans' disability approvals were down by 2/3 from 2001 to 2005. And what were up were veteran suicides and desertions, both increasing during this period of time. And you can see that veteran suicides, the rate in 2005 was about 120 suicides by veterans a week. The Indian Health Service under the Bush-Cheney administration, Day says that Native Americans and Alaska Natives remain the poorest groups in the United States. We still receive very, very little health care through the IHS. IHS has been, I think, chronically underfunded over the years. And the average cost of mainstream health insurance is 40% greater than IHS funding. Strep infections, nutritional and dental deficiencies, diabetes, poor mental health are all higher among Native Americans than any other population in the United States. And mortality rates for alcoholism, cervical cancer, auto crashes, homicides, and suicide rates are higher than the national average. And so this is an area of concern. This minority population is among the most desperately needy as groups go in the United States. And funding has just been quite inadequate. The SAMHSA program, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services program, provide funding for, well, really most of the funds for mental health and substance abuse services were funneled or channeled through SAMHSA. And the funding for these services were cut by $36 million in 2007, relatively late in the Bush administration. Some of those costs were shifted to Medicaid, but remember, of course, Medicaid is criticized for being too expensive as well. So 50 to 60% of funding for mental health services now are coming from Medicaid rather than through the organization or the administration that was supposed to fund mental health and substance abuse services. A trend in dealing with the mentally ill is what is known as the criminalization and incarceration of the mentally ill. More than 16% of those in prisons or jails are severely mentally ill and are likely incarcerated without proper medication or proper psychiatric support. So there have been some efforts through the SAMHSA funding to divert the mentally ill to treatment programs. You will hear about things like the drug court or mental health court. We have them in our state, and there's some efforts underway, I think, to actually implement them here in Kenai as well. And the intention is to get individuals with mental health or substance abuse issues into court, in a court that understands the special needs of those individuals instead of warehousing them in prisons and things to try to get them in the treatment program so that they can stay out of the criminal system. Education funding under the Bush-Cheney. You remember perhaps that Laura Bush was a teacher, and I think George had to pay attention to education because of that. Head Start actually expanded in 2007, provided increased access for children, and also teacher training, more teacher training funded through this School Readiness Act. Now, as is pointed out down below, why Head Start is so important, there's a quote that Day has in the text that says, 1- and 2-year-old children from professional families are exposed to approximately 150,000 more words per week than children with families on welfare, or I should say than children from families with welfare. Than children with families on welfare. Anyway, you get the point here. The inequalities for learning and development persist when these children enter school, and so the idea of Head Start is to do early intervention and education, to have children from these low income and low socioeconomic families be exposed to education, more words and things like that, and also nutrition as well is provided through this program. So it is much more preferred over daycare alone because of all these kinds of important skills that kids learn that they do not learn at home. The No Child Left Behind was sort of the signature education act in the Bush-Cheney administration, and this is laws that some schools say is an unfunded mandate, but nonetheless laws that hold schools accountable for the results of the education of children. So the children are tested at certain years in their education, and if they have to meet certain standards, and if they fall below the certain standards, if there's a certain percentage of students in the schools fall below a certain standards, then the schools have to prove up and bring up those scores, and they are compared from year to year on what's called adequate yearly progress in math and reading skills. And what has happened in this is it's probably pretty evident to anybody that has kids in the higher grades in schools these days, is that the teachers have begun to teach to the tests. They really are focused upon getting those scores up, the cumulative scores up for the schools, so that they meet their adequate yearly progress goals. And a lot of other kinds of education are suffering because of that. So the No Child Left Behind was reauthorized in 2007, but education in general received budget cuts during the same time period. There were some steps backward taken by our conservative Roberts Court, including some integration plans that were declared unconstitutional. One, I think it was, I don't know which ruling this was, but Day quotes the ruling as saying that any solution to segregation that considers race is suspect. I don't understand how they could say that, but that's what it says. And of course, this is just acts to undermine Brown versus Topeka, which was passed in 1954 and was the decision that really started things changing in the United States as far as civil rights is concerned. So this is another area that is worth paying attention to in the years ahead. What happens with this conservative court? I believe that the appointment of Supreme Court justices is probably the single most important thing a president does. And when you vote for a president, presidents come and presidents go. They get elected out after 4 years or 8 years at the most. Supreme Court justices can stay on the bench for life. I think John Paul Stevens left after like 38 years, I believe it was, or might have even been longer than that. It was about 30 some years anyway, and Gerald Ford appointed him, and Ford was president in the mid-70s, and so this is a long time, and these individuals, now men and women, make decisions that affect the laws of our land for generations. And so it's important to kind of keep an eye on the Supreme Court, and when you vote for a president, it's worth figuring out what their political leanings are, whether they're likely to be conservative or liberal or moderate, because who they appoint to the Supreme Court in their 4 years or 8 years can change the very culture of this nation for generations. And so pay attention to that. Pay attention to that. There are issues in public schools during the Bush-Cheney administration, included things like substance abuse among students, bullying, weapons, different mass killings and violence that seemed to be increasing during those years as well. As far as higher education was concerned, low and middle income students, women, minorities all had less access due to programs being cut and funding slashed. Remedial courses eliminated to try to help underprivileged students get the skills necessary to succeed in college. tuition and college housing costs rising steadily during these years. It is interesting to note that for instance, take a look sometimes at the higher education system in Denmark. And Denmark is one of the most prosperous nations in the world. Actually, I think the standard of living or the per capita income or both is one of the highest, if not the highest, in the world. And Denmark provides money to young people, to young adults, to go to university. You don't pay to go to university. You get money from the government while you're in university to help pay your living expenses. And the program says specifically that the government funds that because they don't want families to feel as though they have to be responsible for supporting these young adults while they improve their education. Now that makes sense to me. That just totally makes sense to me. And Denmark does that successfully. And so in America, you put yourself, and nobody knows this better than you put yourselves deep in debt in order to get more education. And there are a lot of theories from conflict theorists who would tell you that the government controls us by the kinds of educational debt we have as we come out of the university. That we're afraid somehow that the interest rate could be raised. That's a concern lately, or that if you miss a payment, that they'll garnish your wages or whatever. That the government really it's a way of kind of keeping control of us by keeping the middle class under the thumb of the elite because of the debt that we create trying to climb the social ladder. So that's a conflict theory, but nonetheless, tuition, college housing costs have gone up in the last years, as you know. So that by the end of this administration, really in the current day, the more and more the student body in any university has become increasingly white, male, and wealthy. The justice system under the Bush-Cheney administration also saw an increase in the number of children in the juvenile justice system. Their incarceration of children up by 208% since 1990. I think this is a statistic from 2009. There is an increasing trend across the nation to try juveniles as adults, even with offenses that are not as serious as some of the adult crimes are. In 2005, a decision of the United States Supreme Court in Roper versus Simmons did prohibit the death penalty being carried out for criminals 18 years and younger. Again, remembering, here it says 17% of all juveniles are African American, and yet 46% of the arrests for violent crimes are African Americans. In the adult correction system, we see harsher drug laws. The war on drugs continues. There's the 3 strikes legislation in many areas, which says that if you've been convicted of a felony 3 times, that you can never get out of jail, that you're there for life. Led to this kind of boom in prison construction, but we also have an aging population because of these laws, an aging population in prison with many more serious medical issues. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world in 2002, and yet this seems to be the answer that we come up with for just about everything. Mandatory sex offender registration and notification laws were implemented nationally with the Adam Walsh Act in 2006. And then finally, taking a look, well, not finally, but nearing the end here, taking a look at the isms in our culture. I call it how we hate those who are not us. Racism with African Americans. During the Bush administration, economic gap between African American and white Americans was 61% in 2007, as it was in 1997. So it's essentially the same. There hasn't been any improvement, or it hasn't gotten worse, I suppose, but it hasn't gotten any better. Those of you that might think back to the Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita, catastrophes in I believe it was it was the mid 2000s, 2005, 2006, and the response to that really reflected discrimination by the administration and by the Federal Emergency Management Administration. African Americans, some still waiting for temporary housing, and the housing that they were given were I think asbestos. There were problems with asbestos in many of the temporary homes, and also there's been an increase in some racist incidents around the nation. They talk about the Jenna 6. She talks about in the book, and you might want to look that up. It's an interesting incident that occurred, I believe, in Louisiana, where it just seemed as though the black youth involved in an incident got much more harsh treatment by the legal system than the white youth who were involved. These noose hangings, I mean, not necessarily lynchings, but with people hanging nooses as a sort of a threat, were beginning to appear around the country, and is a pretty scary thing. Just sort of just a reminder that racism is alive and well. With Latinos, a significant portion of the low-wage working population are Latino. Almost 25% of the children who live in poverty have an immigrant parent. And when we talk about immigrant parents, mostly, as of recently, we're talking about the Latino population. There is a lower rate of their participation in the TANF and Medicaid programs, probably because they're afraid of being deported or being denied citizenship. They lag behind in educational achievements as a group and access to higher education as well. And I think Day is the one who says we hide our prejudices behind the immigration debate. And I think I had suggested that a few weeks back when we talked about it might not have been in this class, but certainly, when you think about the Statue of Liberty and this quotation there about, give me your tired and your poor, or send me your tired and your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And you look now at what we're doing with immigration. We're building walls. The Secure Fence Act, $1.2 billion in funding to build a wall between Mexico and the United States. And we have trucks patrolling that, and we're trying to cut off illegal immigration. The mood and attitude of this nation is very different in terms of immigration. And Phyllis Day suggests, and I would also suggest, that this has something to do with prejudices about Latinos. The Bureau of Indian Affairs oversees sovereign societies within the United States, the Native Americans reservations. But the Bureau of Indian Affairs also is chronically underfunded. For instance, in educational areas, leading to schools with inadequate ventilation, plumbing, fire escape routes, and those kinds of things. I will say again that this population in particular is one of the is really the most desperate of the minority populations. Nearly a quarter of them live below poverty levels. 40% are unemployed. And you can see the statistics there in front of you. Continued attempts by patriarchal society to control women, and through the courts and through the different implementation of laws. Efforts to end or regulate abortion ever since Roe versus Wade. This is another thing that will continue, and you'll want to keep paying attention to with the courts. And the Ledbetter versus Goodyear Tire, this is actually in the Clinton administration, went before the Supreme Court. It was a wage discrimination case where Lilly Ledbetter found that her salary after 20 years of employment was 40% less than men in the same job, and she sued Goodyear Tire. The court ruled against her because of a technicality. But Barack Obama signed the Lilly Ledbetter Act, in fact, somewhere early in his administration, that made sexual discrimination, wage discrimination based on gender illegal. Excuse me. Heterosexism is another ism that we we entertained in our society. And in the military policy throughout the Bush years, implemented during the Clinton years, was the don't ask, don't tell policy, which, again said that, well, we're not going to ask you about your sexual orientation, don't tell anybody about it. But once an individual's sexual orientation became known, if it was homosexual, they would be discharged from the Army. In 2003, the Supreme Court, in the case of Lawrence versus Texas, struck down a Texas law that criminalized sodomy, and indicated that the state did not have a right to interfere in private sexual practices. So this was actually seen as a ruling that was kindly towards homosexuals. In 2004, the state of Massachusetts challenged the Defense of Marriage Act, the federal Defense of Marriage Act, by deciding that their constitution allowed same-sex marriages, and other states have begun to follow suit, if not with full-fledged marriages, then with some civil unions, legalizing civil unions between individuals of the same sex. Matthew Shepard, you may remember, was a young gay man in Wyoming who was murdered by some homophobic individuals who lashed him to a fence, I believe, and beat him, and was gained quite a bit of attention nationally. In 2007, there was an amendment, the Matthew Shepard Amendment, to the Defense Department authorization, but that was deleted, and that the amendment would have allowed FBI enforcement for hate crimes against gays and transgendered people. So Phyllis Day's question, where are we through all of this? And she says, with every mission statement in social work programs or agencies endorses our mission to ensure justice for those with whom we work. However, there seems to be a disconnect from policy to practice. We rarely practice in areas directly connected with clients in poverty or victims of direct or institutional discrimination. And she points out that when we've been involved as a profession in social action and found some success, for instance, in the implementation of the Social Security Act in the 1930s, you can go back into the progressive era, in fact, in the 1920s. The AFDC implementation in the 1950s, the whole implementation, bringing the caretaker into the grant, and really beginning to establish a network of safety network for single mothers with children. The Civil Rights Acts in the 1960s, all of these, there were some successes that the social profession had some hand in, and yet when that social action becomes successful, she says we then abandon the field and leave it to non-professional workers, political appointees, and civil servants, and things have a way of kind of going back to the way they used to be. And she closes this chapter saying, as social responsibility spirals downward under the Bush and Cheney imperial presidency, where created foreign wars have distracted the nation from attention to the needs of our most vulnerable, we should be at the forefront of change. Why are we not? Something for you to think about, particularly for those of you that are in the human services and social work fields of study, as you look forward to your careers and what you want to do with your degree and how you want to intervene with your clients. Phyllis Day has some ideas for you here. And so that's it for this chapter. We have one more chapter to talk about, and we'll be done for the semester. So that's all for this week. Have a good week.